1783, the treaties were signed that actually officially made America independent. By 1787, the country was in serious crisis.
People in other countries are watching this, expecting this is all going to fail.
This is still essentially a project. Can this thing actually work? The stakes are high.
They were under the gun to come up with a government that would save the country.
In May 1787, representatives from the 13 United States of America gathered at the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia, the same place the Declaration of Independence had been signed 11 years earlier. They had come for a constitutional convention intended to revise their current form of government, known as the Articles of Confederation. Over the course of the next 4 months, they would create something radically different, the first complete written constitution for any nation in the history of the world, and the bedrock of American democracy.
We, the people of the United States,
in order to form a more perfect union
and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity,
do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
The Constitution would define the principles of self-government and rights of American citizens. But the fledgling nation was still coming to terms with the momentous decision it had taken 11 years earlier. On the 4th of July, 1776, the 13 American colonies severed their ties with Britain and declared independence.
The Declaration of Independence is not kind of a snap, easy break with a past. It's a traumatic, difficult break because they're breaking away from everything they knew themselves to be. This is a seismic shift. These are people who did consider themselves to be British. This was an important part of their inheritance. Making that break from the king was a dramatic change in who and what they were. It was like stepping into the unknown.
Men and women from Ulster had played a significant role in the movement towards independence. In the decades before the Revolutionary War, up to 250,000 people had emigrated from the north of Ireland to America. They were mainly Ulster Presbyterians, often referred to in America as Scotch-Irish. They came for land, opportunity, and religious freedom. They created churches and colleges and became political and military leaders. They were influential in inciting revolution and in furnishing the ideas and the language that would make the split from Britain possible. But when the American colonies decided to overthrow British rule, they were picking a fight with the biggest military power in the world. The Scotch-Irish would also be critical to winning the war.
People's lives are dramatically turned upside down. And for the very first time, people have to become actors in a way that they haven't been before. People start doing new sorts of things. Common people fighting, common people actually playing roles in government. This is unprecedented for them.
The vast majority of Scotch-Irish who took part in the war fought for the American patriots. They joined in large numbers. But not everyone in America wanted independence. This was a war that divided families and pitted neighbor against neighbor.
You see conflicts within communities, within families even. I mean, Benjamin Franklin's son was a well-known loyalist, right? So you have one of our most famous patriots and his son, who was also high up in political leadership, on different sides and very firmly on different sides. So it's very messy, and it's really not as easy as, you know, half the population is here, the other half is over here. And even during the war, those perspectives change quite a bit. That conflict would go on for about 8 years, so it was a really long war.
The war finally ended with British defeat in 1781. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris formally recognized the United States as an independent, sovereign nation.
When Cornwallis is going to surrender to Washington at Yorktown in 1781, apparently while the British are kind of laying down their arms, they're drumming a tune called The World Turned Upside Down. That is what indeed had happened in the American colonies as they became American states. The world had been turned upside down.
During the war, the 13 colonies had created a government called the Articles of Confederation that united them in a loose alliance while preserving the independence and sovereignty of each colony. In the aftermath of the war, it would struggle to unite them as states within a new nation.
Even after the ink has dried on the Treaty of Paris, the founding generation have to get rid of their British national identity and create an entirely new one. They have to figure out exactly what it means to be an American.
In this post-war world, Scotch-Irish identity was also shifting. New migrants from Ulster continued to come. In Pennsylvania, they made up almost a quarter of the population, but English and Germans were also arriving in large numbers.
The Scots-Irish become one of many groups in this kind of frontier region, and they're jostling for power and jostling for authority with these other groups. The other thing that is also interesting, too, is that there's clear evidence of a lot of intermarriage between different ethnic groups. Male migrants often use marriage to well-placed women in the colonies to anchor themselves and advance themselves, because the Scots-Irish were not planning to go back, and I think that's also quite important. There are large numbers of them who also come over who are from privileged backgrounds. They have education. They become a leadership class very, very quickly, especially in the backcountry. I've come to see the Scots-Irish as a chameleon-like people. They're highly adaptable. They are used to migrating, and to become used to migrating, you have to become accustomed to adaptation, to assimilation, and balancing what you see as your core values with adapting to new circumstances. They may hold dear to many of their cultural or religious values, but nonetheless, they also show a cultural flexibility in ways that are going to advance their interests and help them establish themselves as American families.
In the years after the Revolutionary War, America was united in name only. Disputes between states over territory, taxation, and trade threatened to tear the country apart, and the Articles of Confederation government did not have the powers to intervene. The young nation was in crisis.
1783, the treaties were signed that actually officially made America independent. By 1787, the country, if it wasn't invaded, was going to implode. They had the English on the north, Native Americans and English on the west, Spanish on the south. And the American Army had been disbanded. There were 500 soldiers in the American Army. The biggest problem was that the states did not think of themselves as the United States automatically. Each of the colonies had different births. They had different populations, sometimes different religions, and different histories. America was like Europe before the European market. If you went from France to Italy, you had to change, your francs into lira. Not only were they provincial, but they were competitive. Some of these states had been having trade conflicts and boundary conflicts for decades. And so once the war with Britain was over, they went back to their old ways.
Now that we have won independence, what does government look like in this new landscape? We sometimes think, well, of course, you write the Constitution and then you move forward, but it's complicated. And the Constitution isn't the first thing that we come up with, right? There's a different government called the Articles of Confederation, and the Articles of Confederation are essentially a hot mess.
The Confederation was designed to unite the colonies to fight the war. It basically couldn't do much of anything.
It was very much created based on the experiences of the Patriots who, at this point, despised monarchy, certainly, but what they saw as too much power in a centralized form of government.
People in other countries are watching this, expecting this is all going to fail.
All previous republics had gone the way of Greece and Rome and fallen to demagogues and the mob, and they were by no means confident, and not even all of them especially optimistic, that the American experiment would survive.
Some of the founding generation, especially its political leaders, are starting to think about replacing the Articles of Confederation and creating something new with a strong central government.
What finally convinced the states they had to come up with a better government was not a foreign army, but a rebellion from within. An uprising of largely Scotch-Irish farmers from Pelham, originally called Lisburn, in western Massachusetts. It was named Shays Rebellion after its leader, Daniel Shays, a Revolutionary War hero and the son of an Irish immigrant.
Shays Rebellion is a couple of different stories, if you listen to the American historians. On one hand, Shays Rebellion was the unrest that led to the Constitution. On the other hand, the story that I found when I did my research around Pelham was that Shays Rebellion was a very local phenomenon of people who were resisting really explicitly unjust policies that were coming down from a rising merchant class in Boston. You have this cultural difference between these kind of cosmopolitan elites on the coast and then these traditional, I would say traditional people, right, rural people. We've been playing that out since forever, right? Like looking down on the rubes, right, these caricatures that we have, until you get in trouble and you need somebody to get your car out of the ditch. And then you're totally happy to call the guy with the oxen who can haul it out. The Scots-Irish who were leaving Ulster came to Boston. They were pushed out of Boston. They were driven inland to Pelham, where we're sitting today. This was rocky, sandy, hilly territory that is the least desirable place to farm. And this is where the Scots-Irish set up. The mythology that comes down says that they were famous furniture makers, they were famous weavers, they were famous makers of lace, right? All the things that you can do where you have to make things for yourself and you have long, dark New England nights for working. There's a proud self-reliance to these folks. We would look at them today and say, well, that seems pretty American. I love being the one to tell the story of these proud, self-reliant people who said, nope, we can run this ourselves. We don't need these people from Boston, which is why they called themselves the regulators, picking up that tradition, right, of people who could regulate their own affairs without a central government telling them how it should go.
Massachusetts raises taxes on people. Massachusetts had the highest tax rate of any state in the country at this time. Folks in the western part of Massachusetts think this is really hurting us. These guys are in debt. They can't pay their creditors back. Their creditors go to court, have the sheriff then seize property, and now you're losing your property because you can't pay your debts. Meanwhile, you're being taxed by the state to pay the debt the state owed, but you also think, I helped to pay the debt by fighting in the war.
Those post-war debt problems were problems for all 13 states. But it was only in Massachusetts that when the people said, hey, we're gonna need some relief from this, the elites in Boston said, yeah, no, that's not how it's gonna go. We need to prove the legitimacy of the government. We need to pay these bonds in full. And so the people are gonna have to buckle down and make sacrifices. But for the people in Western Massachusetts, and especially for the Scots-Irish, they felt like they were gonna be brought under lordships again. So what the people did, they would show up at the courthouses, they would deny the judge's entry into the court. People just said, we don't find it convenient to hold court today and have any cases heard where property could change hands. They obstructed the courts non-violently. So the people from other towns get together, and in Concord, in Taunton, in Worcester, they all closed their courts too.
This, of course, does disrupt the constitutional order, and so the governor, James Bowdoin, calls out the militia to prevent the mobs from disrupting the courts, and this provokes the mobs then into resisting the militia, so you have fighting breaking out in the western part of Massachusetts.
Was there score settling? I mean, were there a couple of potash works and warehouses were set on fire? There was very small scale arson as people were settling scores between the classes. But when the people showed up at the courts to obstruct, there's not a record of a stone being thrown through a courthouse window, right? The people were extremely disciplined. They cared as much about this society that they were putting together as anyone else, and they weren't gonna let it be, taken apart by thugs and violence. From the time they started this thing with the first protests in September through the middle of January, the only shots that were fired by the government men.
Shays' rebellion was finally crushed when state militia, financed by Boston businessmen, shot dead 4 rebels and wounded many others. For those politicians who favored a strong new form of government, the uprising was clear evidence of the failings of the Articles of Confederation and a warning that the nation itself was in peril.
This is a rebellion that challenges lots of people to think about the future of this country. And James Bowdoin calls for assistance from the federal government, but there really isn't a federal government. The United States doesn't have troops. It doesn't have a military force of any kind. And also there's a problem. Can the Congress send troops to a state? And that's a difficult conundrum.
When they try to put down this rebellion, the sovereign state of Massachusetts doesn't have the wherewithal to really do it on its own. The federal government doesn't have the wherewithal to do it on its own. And this is, if anything, going to impel certain people to say, if we're going to survive as a union, we need a more durable frame of government. We need a stronger central government. So it will be one of the key issues that's going to impel people to meet down into Philadelphia, at first to, quote, amend, unquote, the Articles of Confederation, but ultimately to draft a new frame of government.
Shays' rebellion had convinced founding fathers like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin of the need for radical change. But it was a generation of political leaders shaped by their experiences in the Revolutionary War. Men like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Ulsterman William Patterson, who would emerge as the architects of the new government.
The
The members that are there in the Constitutional Convention in part represent a changing of the guard to a younger generation of leadership. They're in their early 40s. So, I mean, these are relatively young people leading us towards potentially a new form of government.
These were men with great anxiety. It's hard for people to grasp how anxious they were and how uncertain they were that they could come up with a solution.
There's a mix of delegates in the room at the time, some of whom have come to Philadelphia thinking, Congress told us this is about revising the Articles of Confederation. Our states have told us this is about revising the Articles of Confederation. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to correct for deficiencies that we do see in the current frame of government, but we're not going to blow the whole system up. But we have plenty of delegates who also came to Philadelphia seeing the Articles of Confederation have failed, and we need big, bold change.
The men at the convention represented the clashing priorities and rival ambitions of their different states. Forging a new government and a new constitution would be as complex and difficult as creating the parchment it would be written on.
Our family has been in the leather industry since 1550. I was actually, as far as the records indicate, the first one to make parchment. You know, so this is pretty dehydrated, complete with all the meat and the flesh and everything on it, and all the hair, and all the smell. Once they are washed, they become rehydrated, and then, oh, this guy's heavy. The hair just comes right off. There's not really anyone else who makes parchment, certainly here in the United States. So it's a lot of trial and error, but this is where it starts. One thing I like to remember is like what these things will look like at the end, you know, that sort of process of transformation and how gratifying it is to see something beautiful come out of this.
Before anything could be set down on paper, the delegates had to come to an agreement. But they didn't even all arrive in Philadelphia at the same time.
When they get to Philadelphia, May 1787, they straggle in, it has to be said. They don't all get to Philadelphia right at the same time. You have your early adopters, the people who are gung-ho, we've got to get this thing done, and they're there right from the beginning.
James Madison, of course, arrived early. Madison's a very interesting guy, neurotic as can be, a hypochondriac. Many of his letters begin with, I've come down with some strange disease. He was always ill and always a little anxious, and he arrived quite early. Madison was a great strategist, and he knew that he who controls the agenda wins. So Madison arrived with a plan. He set the agenda for the convention. But Madison knew that he was, you know, he's a little tiny guy and he was balding and he was anxious and nervous. So he gets Edmund Randolph, who is this 6 foot tall, good looking gentleman planter. He was Mr. Smooth. He presented the plan because more people would listen to him.
Madison's plan, which became known as the Virginia Plan, called for the states to give up many of their powers to a strong national government designed with 3 distinct branches: an executive, a judiciary, and a legislature divided into 2 chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate, where representation was determined by the population of each state.
The Virginia Plan becomes the framing device for the entire convention, an ambitious new plan of government.
For Madison, the supremacy of national authority, as he calls it, is the goal here, right? And the idea is a strong central government. And it's a bold statement, right, of like what government should look like.
At the Constitutional Convention, the major part of that discussion was fear of ineffectiveness combined with fear of tyranny. One of the most interesting parts of the Constitutional Convention is that the most framers that were part of a single religion were actually from the Calvinist tradition. And the majority of those were Presbyterian. About 10 of those framers were educated at the College of New Jersey, which is now Princeton University.
Presbyterianism in America had been shaped by immigrants and church leaders from Ulster, and Princeton University grew out of a theological college set up by Scotch-Irish Presbyterians.
John Witherspoon, a Scottish immigrant, was brought over here, invited to the colonies to serve as the president of the College of New Jersey, what we know today as Princeton University. John Witherspoon was an incredibly important person in the lead up to the Revolution and through the Revolution. In the British Parliament, Horace Walpole said that Cousin America has run off with a Presbyterian parson, which was referring to John Witherspoon. In fact, the British saw John Witherspoon and his little college as such a hotbed of radicalism that on July 20th, 1776, British soldiers burned John Witherspoon in effigy in Princeton. And so there is this sense that Presbyterians, with their belief in religious liberty and civil liberty, in the separation of church and state, in the freedom to resist tyranny, were the leaders of what was happening.
John Witherspoon was referred to as a political firebrand because he was there in the trenches of the intellectual warfare that started even before the Declaration of Independence. He was crafting how you talk about getting rid of a monarchy. So James Madison became one of his students, came from Virginia to New Jersey, and they had a very close relationship. James Madison himself said that as part of his college education, he retained a strong dose of Calvinism that was directly from Witherspoon. And so the principles of Calvinism, representation, the need for systemic reform, not just reforming individuals, is crucial to the Constitution's success. Madison brought that to the table.
Not all of the Princeton graduates who were at the Constitutional Convention agreed with the radical form of government proposed by James Madison.
There are figures in the room that must have been visibly uncomfortable with it, where the gears are starting to turn and where they're already beginning to think, is this a fait accompli? Delegates like William Paterson of New Jersey.
William Paterson had been born in County Antrim, was educated at Princeton, and had become the first Attorney General of New Jersey.
William Paterson is really ensconced in the politics of New Jersey. Now, he can think in quite broad-minded ways because his Princeton education, really, he read deeply in philosophy and morals and logic. But William Paterson comes to the Constitutional Convention, quite specifically, trying to represent his state and the interests of smaller states, and still committed to a government like the Articles of Confederation, rooted in state power and state sovereignty. He's seeing a Virginian up here ready to upend that entire system. And what Paterson effectively says is, if you do that, we, the small states, are going to be trampled by the more populous states, and we're not going to let that happen. If we have to, we'll just leave this convention.
Delegates from small states like New Jersey saw the Virginia Plan as a power grab. If representation to a new government was based on population size, then large states like Virginia and Pennsylvania would dominate national government.
Each state saw itself as a separate country, and most people thought that the reason the revolution had been fought was so their state could make the laws for them.
Because the congressional representation is chosen off of the population, it's a plan that would be very popular in places like Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, but really, really unpopular in Delaware, Rhode Island, New Jersey, right? These small population states. They worry that in this kind of system with a strong central government, will they just be subsumed by their neighbors?
On June 15th, William Patterson of New Jersey comes to the floor and presents what's known as the New Jersey Plan.
Patterson proposed a national government with limited powers and just one chamber in which each state had equal representation.
Madison was so adamant that they wouldn't back down. They just absolutely wouldn't back down. That was probably the most precarious moment in the convention.
One of the delegates from Delaware, he says, I don't trust you guys. You know, if we're doing it just based off population, Delaware is a very small state. I don't trust you to govern in our best interest.
This debate over congressional representation, the stakes could not have possibly been higher, and the tempers couldn't have possibly been much higher. The convention deadlocks over what to do about this.
This is still essentially a project, an American project of like, can this thing actually work? Or is it going to fracture into 3 different republics, or 2, or 13? What's going to happen here? And so the stakes are high to find some kind of compromise.
Hamilton said very little at the convention, but he got up and he gave a speech. His solution was extremely radical. At one point, he just said we should abolish the states. He wanted just one big government. You can imagine the tension in this room with this group who thought they were under the gun to come up with a government that would save the country.
On the 5th of July, delegates from Connecticut proposed a compromise, a government with 2 chambers. The House of Representatives, based on a state's population, as per the Virginia plan, but in a concession to the New Jersey plan, each state would have 2 delegates in the Senate, no matter what their size.
The Great Compromise pulls from the Virginia plan, it pulls from the New Jersey plan, and for certain delegates who supported the New Jersey plan and opposed the Virginia plan, they're relatively happy with the Great Compromise. And so if you take William Patterson, he largely concludes that this new Constitution, it's going to satisfy my concerns. And to be clear, William Patterson's concerns were massive before that compromise. The delegates agreed to it, and so they have finally settled this issue that vexed them since the beginning of the convention. How are we going to organize Congress?
One of the other things that the Constitutional Convention has to hammer out is like, what's the relationship to slavery here in this country?
They were not going to abolish slavery. A lot of them said, yes, slavery is terrible, but it wasn't the burning issue in their life. Some of them had a fantasy that it would just sort of disappear. But if you had proportional representation, did slaves count?
If they did count, then those states with a large number of enslaved people would get proportionately more representation in the new House of Representatives.
There's an argument about these things, right? If they're men, then let them vote or free them, right? And if they're not, then like, why are we counting them? Because we're not counting any other form of property, right? They are struggling intellectually with something that they have grown accustomed to, and for some of them grown very comfortable with.
James McHenry, a delegate from Maryland, had grown up in Ballymena, and served as George Washington's secretary during the war. Like many men in the room, he understood slavery was wrong. Yet he never freed the 7 enslaved people he kept in his household.
Many Scots-Irish immigrants from Ulster would have arrived viewing slavery as a moral evil. The longer they live, especially in the backcountry and especially in the South, the less true that becomes. Slavery in the backcountry is not plantation slavery, the way we think of it on the coasts. Large plantations with dozens or 50 or even 100 plus slaves. Slavery in the backcountry is much more about social mobility. It's having the resources to have a slave who's doing some of the labor that keeps a small family farm going and makes it a little more profitable. It's not leaping ahead into the elite, but it is inching up the social ladder. By the time we get after the Revolution, most backcountry Presbyterians have made their peace with the idea that slavery is just part of the economic life of the South. The utility of slavery to these families becomes more important than the moral teachings that they would have heard growing up.
There are a handful of delegates who are really grappling with this question of slavery and its place in a nation that prides itself on liberty and sort of like people's personal rights.
Enslavement itself is never mentioned in the Constitution. The word slavery never appears. That was quite intentional. There were already many members of the Constitutional Convention who were opposed to slavery. They didn't want to entrench it in the Constitution.
The delegates came up with a compromise. In deciding a state's population for representation and taxes, enslaved people would be counted as 3/5 of a person.
For lots of people, this is taken as a very dehumanizing sort of feature of the Constitution. As I see it, actually what the Constitution did was put the country on a trajectory for the abolition of enslavement. So I do sometimes talk about the Constitution as a sort of a diamond that you may have found in the dunghill. It was a world with enslavement for sure, and domination of other kinds as well. But an instrument for actually delivering human freedom was created in that context. So I am in favor of keeping the diamond, cleaning it up, so forth, and going on in life with it.
It would be another 78 years before enslavement was finally abolished in America. One group who consistently advocated for abolition were Scotch-Irish Covenanters in the Carolina backcountry.
Covenanting Presbyterians are the radical, fanatical wing of Presbyterianism. Scholars have called them a Presbyterian Taliban. Going back to the 1600s and their conflict with the Crown, Covenanting Presbyterians saw every form of tyranny as equally evil. The tyranny that might come from a distant king into your community, or a distant bishop who the people of your church had not elected, or of a slaveholder, were kind of one and the same thing in their minds. Lex Rex, the famous document by Samuel Rutherford that says the law is the king even over the king, says that that law disavows any type of oppression of one person owning the rights of another. For many people who would have said that was true in Scotland or Ireland, by the time they arrive in the American South, that seems less relevant to them. But for the Covenanters, they did not feel that those rules had changed in the process of crossing an ocean. So if slavery had been wrong when the Crown was trying to do it to their ancestors, then slavery was wrong when you were trying to implement it onto African slaves in the South.
In the decades to come, as slavery became even more entrenched in the southern states, many Covenanters moved north and west where slavery was prohibited.
There they will become underground railroad stations, places that runaway slaves can know they can safely hide on their way to freedom. The difference in the Covenanters and, say, the Quakers is not that they weren't both rabidly anti-slavery. It's that if you ended up with a Quaker family, they would be peaceful. But if you ended up finding a Covenanting station, they'd likely protect you with a gun.
Throughout the summer of 1787, the men at the Constitutional Convention continued to agonize over how the United States should be run. And what haunted them most was how to protect the nation from tyranny.
You've never met a group of men more worried about power in your life. These men knew they would be the men running the government, and yet they feared themselves. They didn't have the kind of hubris that politicians in the 21st century have. They were really obsessed with how to grant enough power for the government to function, but make sure that tyranny couldn't arise.
The discussion was, how can you limit the president, but still have the president with the power to engage and protect during emergencies? They knew firsthand the tyranny of the executive because they knew what a monarchy was capable of doing.
Got it there. Yep.
The question of executive power versus the power of the people is the central political debate. Hamilton fears democracy as the instantiation of the mob and wants a strong executive elected for life so he won't be tempted to seduce the people and bribe them with cheap luxuries. Others fear a would-be demagogue, but one who'll come from above rather than below. Their solution is a one-year term limit for the president because they fear that a future president might lose an election by a few votes, cry foul, and refuse to leave office.
They believed that all men, given some power, would try to get more power. They had a very dismal view of human nature. And so you see them giving the president power, hemming it around with something, giving the Senate power, hemming it around, hemming around the House.
It's just a wonderful accident of history that at the same time that the framers were gathering to draft a constitution, across Philadelphia at the very same time, the Presbyterian Church was reforming its own constitution. And the same principles were being debated in both about representation and liberty. They were using the Presbyterian concept of what you must do is limit power in all of its iterations. And so you have separation of powers. They're intended to come up against each other and to halt each other's overtaking of the other's power. We have dual sovereigns. We have the federal government and the states. And then you have the separation of church and state. And they're intended to limit each other. The discussion, though not overtly religious, borrowed heavily from the Presbyterian form of government that was actually being formed at the same time. One of the phrases that came out of the Presbyterian Constitution was that it was reformed, always reforming. That was exactly the attitude of the framers. And that's why we have Article 5 of the Constitution, which lays out the possibility of amendments. They knew this was not going to be a perfect document. They knew that when humans picked it up, it was quite dangerous. But they believed that they did the best they could with what they had. And so what they delivered to Congress was, in effect, a trial balloon, an experiment that they thought could limit abuses of power.
On the 17th of September, the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia agreed on the final draft of the United States Constitution.
Benjamin Franklin stands up at the end of the Constitutional Convention on the last day saying, it's not perfect, I have my own reservations, but I also don't believe we could do anything better, and we desperately need this. So he then said, I would urge us all to bury our reservations, never to speak about them, and to sign this unanimously. And that was one of his most important contributions, in fact.
For nearly 4 months, the men in Philadelphia had debated in secret. Now the Constitution they had created was about to go public, to be ratified or rejected by each of the states.
The framers in Philadelphia, they create this new form of government, but what they also know is that without the assent of the people inside the states, this new framework of government is nothing more than a piece of paper.
Public opinion was sharply divided. Those who endorsed the Constitution called themselves Federalists. Those who opposed it became known as Anti-Federalists. The Scotch-Irish were to be found in both camps.
And the first big battle over the Constitution, the first big state to debate it, is Pennsylvania. And it's William Finley who emerges as one of the most powerful and critical voices inside of the Pennsylvania Convention. He echoes a lot of the arguments we see by anti-federalists throughout the other ratification fights.
A Covenanting Presbyterian from County Antrim, William Findlay had fought for the American Patriots in the Revolutionary War and was a representative in the Pennsylvania State Assembly.
On the anti-federalist side, William Findlay and John Smiley, both born of farming stock, both weavers in the north of Ireland, and they are concerned with the kinds of power that would be centralized in the federal government. Finlay, who growing up would have known of landlordism, said, I cannot conceive of a better plan to contrive an aristocracy.
Once you cede power to a distant national government, you're unlikely to get it back.
This is a movement away from the promises of the revolution, away from the Declaration of Independence. At least that's how the anti-federalists would have seen it. The consistent refrain was, where is the Bill of Rights? Why isn't there a Bill of Rights? Why aren't our rights recognized?
Many Americans today think of the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, as at the absolute core of our constitutional system, but those weren't written at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. The delegates quite consciously chose not to add a Bill of Rights at the end of the convention.
You have to envision what it was like to spend 4 months in Philadelphia in the summer. Most of them were staying in taverns, and they were sleeping sometimes 2 to a bed. And the food in the taverns made McDonald's look gourmet. So September comes, and everybody is going, my bags are packed, I'm going home. And George Mason stands up and he says, wait a minute, we have to pass a Bill of Rights. And you can just imagine the groans in the room. Then he had the nerve to say, it won't take long. There had been no issue at the convention that was solved quickly. Roger Sherman from Connecticut stands up and he says, we don't need a Bill of Rights. Almost all the state constitutions have them. And everything that would be in a Bill of Rights, the states are in charge of. we don't have any power to impose anything, so we don't need it. And everybody goes, yay! I mean, I'm picturing it, yay! And they all go home.
But they hadn't anticipated the backlash to this from vocal critics of the Constitution like William Findlay. When James Madison realized how close the Constitution was to being rejected, he gave in to anti-federalist demands and added a Bill of Rights.
Madison said, if we do not do it, most of the people in this country will not trust us. And he was right.
The objections to the lack of the explicit protection of basic human rights were so strong that they would not have achieved ratification without the accompanying promise that they would immediately turn to amending the Constitution with those first 10 amendments.
The Bill of Rights, that list of amendments that guarantees civil rights and liberties like freedom of speech, press, and religion, satisfied most of those opponents of the Constitution. But there was one group for whom the separation of church and state was unacceptable.
When the Constitution is published and circulated for debate and discussion and eventually ratification, the first thing that the Presbyterians of the backcountry notice is that God's not in it, and slavery is. The only reference to religion in it at all is to disqualify religion for political office. In essence, saying religion is not going to be part of our government and part of the way we run our system. A godless Constitution doesn't land well, and it especially doesn't land well with the covenanting, kind of radical fringe of Presbyterians. The people who had signed a covenant with God were not about to sign a covenant with Alexander Hamilton. They were willing to fight a battle with a tyrannical Britain, but then they turned their ire on this idea of a godless America. The Covenanters spend the next century building a movement to try to Christianize the US government. The legacy of the Covenanters is that they should never have been given real power, but out of power they could mount strident and important critiques about what was going wrong. The Covenanters were the kind of most inconvenient moralists in early America. Their vision of a world without tyranny, without oppression, created important critiques along the way. And they could point to things like slavery and say, this isn't right, and no good nation would do something like this.
The Constitution was finally ratified in June 1788.
This is calfskin, which is what the original was done on. And this is calfskin made here by us, in learning its importance and realizing just how difficult it is to produce something like this. Just even to make the material and to be able to do it here, it's very satisfying.
The Constitution became the official framework of the government of the United States of America and one of the most famous documents in history.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility,
provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity.
Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
The U.S. Constitution is just a brilliant achievement. Those were periods of invention, times of invention, and what was being invented was the institutional structure for protecting human freedom. It was science of democracy, actually.
People ask me often, do you think they were heroes? And I say yes. because of their willingness to compromise, to get something done in ways that modern American politics have completely forgotten.
Despite its inspiring achievement, the Constitution is fragile, and the founders believed that it was up to the virtue of the people. But they had to be committed to civil dialogue and debate, how to disagree without being disagreeable, how to listen to competing points of view. It's exactly the spirit that we have to get back to today.
It's a living document, intentionally. The founders put mechanisms in it for it to be amended because they knew we don't have all the answers here in this moment. We're still figuring it out. Slavery gets abolished. That's in the Constitution now, right? Adding women's suffrage, that's in the Constitution. And so this kind of like living, breathing document is really an incredible thing. I think that it really is a brilliant piece of workmanship.
Men and women from Ulster left an indelible imprint on the formation of the democratic institutions of the United States of America. Shays' Rebellion has gone down in history as the catalyst that led to the Constitution. William Paterson, born in Antrim, defended equal representation for the states and helped shape a federal system that balanced national authority with state power. William Findlay, a weaver from Ulster, was a leading spokesman for the creation of the Bill of Rights. Colleges established by Scotch-Irish immigrants and the churches they built informed the thinking of the founding fathers of American democracy. In the decades to come, people from the north of Ireland would continue to come to the United States in ever greater numbers, but few would have the impact and the influence on American history of those who arrived at the point when the world was about to be turned upside down, when America declared independence.